Amen. Thank you for that. And let's continue to remember these. Pray for each one. Ask the Lord to help be a part of what they're going through. Well, the book of Job, one of the great books of the Bible. We've been talking about it for the last several weeks, but let me just kind of, as I do each Wednesday night, because I know different ones are able to be here and others are out because it's summertime. We've got so many folks traveling, different things. But let me just very quickly reset where we are. The book of Job, the oldest book in the Bible, chronologically, if you were to take the Bible, you'd take the first 11 chapters of Genesis, the story of creation and the flood, and then right there insert the book of Job, because the book of Job happens before Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, the law, all of that. And the reason we know that, among others, is because they have all these, 30 some odd chapters of deep theological discussion and never mention any of those people. And there's no way they could have discussed all that if it had happened yet without referencing some of the law, the Ten Commandments, the sacrificial system, the history of Abraham, the Jewish people. None of that comes up. So Job's a very ancient book. Now here's the way it happens. We're going to get to chapter 6 and 7 in a moment, but here's what we've seen so far in the first 5 chapters. Chapter 1, Satan appears in heaven. God says, hey, have you seen my guy Job? Job is a perfect and an upright man. Now, the word perfect there means complete. In other words, God is saying, this guy is the perfect example of what a follower of God should be. He is the guy. He is my prime example of what I want everybody else to be like. Satan says, yeah, he loves you, but only because you blessed him. Only because you've been good to him. Let me take away some of that, he'll curse you to your face. God says, okay, you can touch his stuff, but you can't touch him. And so Satan goes out, and as we talked about, within just a 24-hour period, Job loses all of his wealth, and he was the richest man in his part of the world. He loses all of his animals, all of his servants. He loses everything. Then his 10 children were in a house together in the oldest brother's house. A tornado hits, collapses the house. All 10 kids die. We read those verses so many times, but we never sometimes picture in our head Job and his wife standing in front of 10 coffins and 10 graves bearing all 10 of their children at one time. But then chapter 1 ends with Job saying, you know what? I came into this world with nothing. I'm going out with nothing. Whatever I have, God gave me. If God sees fit to take it away, that's up to God. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Chapter 2, Satan comes back before God. God says, told you, he's my guy. He is my guy. Satan says, yeah, but only because you build a hedge around him. You let me touch all of his stuff. Let me touch him, and he'll curse you to your face. God says, okay, but he won't. Satan goes out, strikes Job from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet with boils. We've talked about this at length. Could you imagine? If you have one bad boil on your skin, you know how irritating, painful, and horrible it can be. Imagine having every inch of your body covered with boils that are oozing and bleeding and itching and just driving you almost to the point of insanity. Job, the only relief he can find is to sit in a pile of warm ashes, take a broken piece of pottery, rub it over his body, trying to get what little relief he can. And then on top of all that, in the midst of that, his wife abandons him, says, you know what, you're a fool, you ought to curse God and die. And she's out. So now Job has officially lost everything, including his health. And then 3 friends, Job's 3 buddies, show up. Now I can imagine when Job saw these 3 guys, and they come from different towns, but when Job saw these 3 guys walking up, you know what he thought? Finally, somebody to encourage me. Somebody to put an arm around me. Somebody to tell me it's going to be okay. And Job's chapter 2 ends with Job's 3 friends sitting down around him. And the Bible says for 1 solid week, for 7 whole days, nobody said a word. They were so shocked at the condition he was in and all that had happened, nobody could say anything. And then finally in chapter 3, Job begins to speak. And as we've talked about, even though from chapter 3 to chapter 41, 42 is a lot of chapters, it all happens in one day. It's just a series of conversations. What's going to happen is Job's going to talk, and then each of his 3 friends are going to talk. After they give a speech, Job will respond to each one. Then they'll make another cycle, and then they'll start a 3rd cycle, and that's going to get us to the end of the book. All of these conversations are very compressed. Now, Job stands up in chapter 3, and he says, fellas, I wish I was dead. He says, now remember, Satan said, Job will curse you, God, to your face. Job didn't curse God. Now he cursed, not in the sense of profanity, but in the sense of cursing something. He didn't curse God. What did he curse? He cursed the day he was born. He said, I wish I'd never been born. If I'd known I was going to have to endure this much pain, this much agony, this much loss, this much suffering, I wish I'd never been born. And Job goes on for a little bit, and he just talks to his friends about the sorrow and the hurt and the pain that he's in. And then he stops. And then in chapter 5, the first of Job's friends, because Job speaks in chapter 3 and chapter 4. In chapter 5, his first friend, a man named Eliphaz, stands up to speak. Now, that's what we talked about last week. This friend talks, and I'm just going to remind you of a couple of things this friend said. We're not looking at all the verses because of time's sake, because it's a really big book, but I want to remind you of 2 or 3 things this guy said because it lays the groundwork for everything all of them are going to say. Then Eliphaz, the Temanite, answered and said, this is in chapter 4, verse 1, Job just finished talking. He stands up to answer Job. Now remember, all Job said was, I'm in terrible pain and suffering and sorrow. I wish I'd never been born. This guy stands up and answered and said, if we essay to commune with thee, wilt thou be grieved? But who can withhold himself from speaking? Now, as we talked about last Wednesday night, basically what he's saying right there is he's saying, we want to tell you something. Hope you don't get mad. And remember, we talked about last Wednesday night, anytime somebody walks up to you and says, I need to tell you something, please don't get mad. You know the one thing for sure you're about to do? Get mad. If somebody says, I hope you don't get mad at what I'm about to tell you, you know you're going to get mad. Because you know it's going to be something bad, negative, critical. So he says, hope you won't get mad, but we want to tell you something. You know, hope you'll listen. We got to, I love this. Who can withhold himself from speaking? You know what he's saying? That's what a lot of people say today. I just can't, I just got to say it. I just got to say it. I can't help myself. I'm one of them people. Whatever comes up, comes out. And as I've said over and over and over down through the years, that's so not true. People that use that as an excuse to criticize, gossip, tear people down, they're being so unchristian and so unbiblical. And the reason I know that nobody has to say everything they think, every time you get pulled over by a police officer, you don't do that. So we can exercise control. It's just that most of the time, what? We don't want to. We want to say what we want to say. So that's what this guy is saying. Now listen, he goes on, look, we're just going to hit parts of this. This is what we looked at last week. He said, behold, thou hast instructed many, thou hast strengthened the weak hands, but now it has come upon thee, and thou faintest, it toucheth thee, and thou art troubled. Now listen how he starts off. This is the very beginning. He says, you know what, Job? Basically, here's what he says. You can dish it out to everybody else, but what? You can't take it. You've told everybody else that they got to be strong, that they got to trust God, that they got to lean on their faith. But now it's come to you, and you're about to faint away. Now, what's the difference? That sounds good, but here's the reality. Can you equate what Job has gone through? Has anybody in history ever gone through that? To within a few days lose your riches, your animals, your herds, your flocks, your servants, all 10 children killed in a single blow, then to lose your health, then to lose your wife. Has anybody else suffered like that ever? I don't think so. It's not fair for these guys to say, well, you told nobody else has been through what Job's been through. So number one, you can't equate it. But number two, and we talked about this last time, one of the hardest things in life to do is to encourage yourself. Of course, we can encourage others. But when we're down, you know what we need? Somebody to encourage us. It's hard to be self-encouraging. And especially when you're in the situation Job's in, and they're like, well, why can't you just encourage yourself? You encourage everybody else. Why can't you take your own advice? These guys are not being real comforting so far. Now, he gets on down to verse 12, and here's where it really gets dicey. This is still Eliphaz speaking. Now, a thing was secretly brought to me, and mine ear received a little thereof, in thoughts from the visions of the night when deep sleep falleth on man. In other words, here's what he said. He said, God told me. Listen, I've been pastoring for over 25 years. And nothing sets off the alarm bells in my head and makes the hair on my neck stand up than when somebody walks up to me and says, God told me to tell you something. That's what he just did. He said, I got this spiritual insight I'm supposed to deliver to you. Well, as far as I know, everything God has to say, he said it in that Bible you're holding in your hands. But when people try and spiritualize you like that and say, well, God wants me to tell you, you know what I've learned through all these years? Most of the time when people say, God wants me to tell you, you know what they're really saying? They're saying, I want to say this, but I don't want to take the blame, so I'm gonna say God told me to tell you this. And that's what these guys are doing. This vision came to me, and so, now, let me explain. So he uses that tack. Then he comes to the end of it. At the end of chapter 5, listen to what he says. This lays the groundwork for everything that's coming. Behold, happy is the man whom God correcteth, therefore despise thou not the chastening of the Almighty. Now, what is he assuming? If he tells Job, don't fight back when God punishes you. Don't fight back when God spanks you. He's laying the groundwork for all their arguments, which is, when do you punish your children? When they've what? When they've done something wrong, right? That's the groundwork for everything that's coming. The thing that all three of these guys have agreed on is, good things come to good people from God. Bad things come to bad people from God. Therefore, if something bad is happening to you, you've been a bad person. That sounds just like TV Evangelist. It's the prosperity gospel. Here's the birth of it. If you do good, God will bless you. If you do bad, God will punish you. That sounds good, but that's not true. There are people who live horrible, evil lives for 60, 70 years and just cruise through life. There are other people, including most of the people in the Bible, almost every person you'll read about in the Bible who tried to serve God. What about the Apostle Paul? Is he a good guy? How many good things happened to him? With this philosophy, you know what they would have said to Paul? You're doing something wrong. You're doing something wrong. All these bad things are happening to you. You must be doing something wrong. And that's what they're saying to Job. And this is going to become the basis of everything they say. And then I love this. This is the last thing, and then we're going to get to the new. He says, lo this, we, notice this word, circle that word right there. We have searched it, and I love this, so it is. In other words, here's what he just said. Before we came to see you, the three of us got together. We talked about this, and this is the answer. Have you ever noticed how people can solve everybody else's problems but their own? Didn't Jesus say something about that one time to the Pharisees? That, hey, you guys can see that little bitty speck in other people's eyes, but you can't see that big log sticking through your own head. Well, these guys, they're like, we have figured out your problem, Job, and you need to just sit back and listen to us. Don't fight back. Just hear it. Know thou it for thy good. In other words, don't argue with us. Don't fight back. We're going to tell you what you've done wrong. We're going to tell you what the problem is. You need to listen. And then Job answers. Now this takes us to, we're going to scoot through this really, really fast, so watch carefully. We're not going to hit all these verses in chapter 6 and 7, but some of them. But Job answered and said, now watch this really good. Oh, that my grief were thoroughly weighed and my calamity laid in the balances together. For now it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. Therefore my words are swallowed up. In other words, Job says, and here's something you guys don't understand. What I'm going through is unparalleled. You say I've encouraged, nobody else, Job is being really honest. Nobody else has gone through what he's gone through. Nobody has. He says, what I've gone through is heavier than the sand of the sea. Imagine the weight there. I mean, if you ever dug around in the beach with your kids, you know how heavy sand is? Job says, what I'm going through is heavier than all the sand and all the seas, okay? Then he goes on. For the arrows of the Almighty are within me, the poison whereof drinketh up my spirit. The terrors of God do set themselves in array against me. Doth the wild ass bray when he hath grass, or loweth the ox over his fodder? In other words, Job is saying, I'm not just crying wolf here. I'm not just complaining to complain. I am really going through something here. This is serious business. And then Job asked one of the great questions of all time. Can that which is unsavory be eaten without salt? There's one. Or is there any taste in the white of an egg? There's two. That's two really good questions. In other words, he says, doesn't salt make everything taste better? Now, I know a bunch of people that would agree with that. Now, listen, trust me, I got plenty of bad habits. Salt's not one of them. I don't salt anything. But every time we take Rosemary's dad out to eat, which is a couple times a week, and I remember her mom would tell him, Duck, you salting that before you even taste it. I mean, it's just automatic reflex. He gets food, salt. And I don't mean a sprinkle. I mean a shower, a downpour. But Job says, hey, you know what? Doesn't salt make everything taste better? And then this is one of the truest statements ever. Is there any taste in the white of an egg? I know these people on this hill, they say, well, all I eat is the white of an egg. And I'm like, well, why don't you just eat some cardboard? It's about the same. The yellow is what makes it good, right? Well, Job pointed that out a long, long time ago. And then watch, now he's about to get serious. Oh, that I might have my request. What is his request? What does Job want? And that God would grant me the thing that I long for. What do you think he longs for? He made it clear in chapter 3. He's about to say it again. Even that it would please God to what? Destroy me. In other words, what does Job want? Death. That's what Job wants. That he would let loose his hand and cut me off. What Job is saying is, I wish God would just go ahead and take my life. It's a sad moment when somebody comes to the place where they're saying, you know what? This life, I'm in such misery and sorrow and hurt and pain that I would rather die than live another day. That's where Job is. Job says, fellas, I'm not playing around here. I'm not trying to be dramatic. I'm not a drama queen. I'm not trying to overstate anything. I'm telling you, I wish God would go ahead and take my life because I'm in such sorrow and pain and hurt and misery over the loss of my children, over everything that's befallen me. He says, I wish I could just go. Remember 2 weeks ago when we talked in chapter 3, Job said, at least in the grave, there's rest. He said, at least I'd be out of all this. At least I wouldn't have to suffer anymore. He says, I wish God would just take my life. Now watch this. Then, if he died, if his life ended, then should I have yet comfort. Yea, I would harden myself in sorrow. Let him not spare, for I have not concealed the words of the Holy One. In other words, Job is saying again, if God would just take my life, at least then I'd be comforted. In other words, what's that saying that we often say when somebody passes away? What are those three little letters stand for? RIP stands for what? Rest in peace. Job is saying, at least then I could rest in peace. At least then I'd be out of all of this. Now look a little further. We're skipping some, but look a little further. To him that is afflicted, look at this very carefully. This is Job's first shot at his three friends. To him that is afflicted, pity should be shown from who? His friends. But he forsaketh the fear of the Almighty. In other words, Job looks at his three guys and he says, you know what? When somebody's hurting, you ought to try and comfort them. You ought to try and lift them up. You ought to try and make them feel better. This is Job's, and by the way, as these cycles of conversation go, all of them, his three friends and Job, are going to get louder and louder and angrier and angrier. Every time I have a situation where I have to confront them, Rosemary, the question she always asks me, do you get loud? Do you get loud? Because don't we all, as something kind of spirals out of control, our tendency is we get louder and louder? Well, that's what they're going to do. This is Job's first little shot back. They're telling him, you've done something wrong. God is correcting you. God is punishing you. You clearly have done something. And Job is saying, you know what? Usually, when somebody's hurting, their friends try and make them feel better. You guys aren't really doing that. My brethren, that's his three buddies right there, have dealt deceitfully as a brook and as a stream brook of brooks that pass away. He's telling these guys, you aren't doing what you ought to be doing. You are my three closest friends in this world. You know what I've lost. You should be putting your arms around me and telling me it's going to be okay. And you should be lifting me up. But instead, you're tearing me down instead. For now you're nothing. You see my casting down and are afraid. Did I say, bring unto me or give a reward of your substance? I love this. Again, Job's taking little subtle shots here. When he says, did I say bring unto me? You know what he's basically saying? I don't think I invited you guys to come. I don't think I asked you to come see me. And I certainly didn't ask you to bring me anything. But if you're going to come, at least show a little mercy and a little grace. Do you know what so many people in this world need? And this is why I preach a lot on these topics. Because the older I've gotten, one of the things I've realized is that every Sunday morning, when this place, when people come in and this place fills up, you know what I know? There's a lot of hurting people out there. There are people that have gone through things this week that maybe none of us know about, or maybe we do. I look around the congregation sometimes and I look at certain people and I know what they're going through. I know the situation that they're dealing with. And what they need, oftentimes, I'm not saying every service, but oftentimes, you know what people need? For somebody to say, listen, God loves you. God's going to help you. You're going to get through this. Better days are coming. And Job is saying, you guys haven't done any of that for me. Or deliver me from the enemy's hand, or redeem me from the hand of the Almighty. Teach me, and I will hold my tongue. Cause me to understand wherein I have erred. In other words, he said, if I've done something wrong, if I've done something to make God do all this to me, tell me what it is. Tell me what I've done wrong. How forcible are right words, but what doth your arguing reprove? Now notice, he says, when somebody says right words, those are powerful. He says, but what you're saying is not right. You don't know what you're talking about is basically what he's saying. And if you doubt that, listen to this. Do you imagine to reprove words and the speechless of one that is desperate, which are as wind? In other words, he's basically saying, what you're saying, just a bunch of hot air. Just a bunch of hot air. That's all it is. Doesn't mean anything because you don't know what you're talking about. Now, real quickly, we're going to race through this last part because there's something I want to come to here in chapter 7. Yea, you overwhelm the fatherless and you dig a pit for your friend. That's how Job is feeling about his three buddies right now. And it's going to get worse. Now, therefore, be content. Look upon me, for it is evident unto you if I lie. Job says, if I'm lying, you ought to be able to look at me and tell. If I've done something wrong, if I've done something to make God this angry at me, tell me what it is. I'll ask him to forgive me. But right now, what you guys are saying is just so much hot air. And then we come to chapter 7. Is there not an appointed time to man upon earth? Are not his days also like the days of a hireling? You know what? And Job's going to come back to this theme later. This is something everybody here, because I know on a Wednesday night, it's mostly older folks with a few exceptions. You know what all of us, by the time you hit 40, 50, 60, you know what we figure out? Our life is flying by. Our life is just going so fast. And that's what Job is pointing out here. He says, you know what? We have an appointed time on this earth. In other words, you know something Job's figured out? Our life is bookended. Birth, death. We don't get to live forever. And he says our days are like that of a hireling. In other words, a hireling is somebody that you literally hire for a short period of time. What he's saying is our life is very, very short. It seems, you know, when you're 15 years old, if somebody tells you, hey, you're going to live to be 60, you know what you think? Man, that's an eternity. And then you turn around and blink a couple of times, and guess what? Oh, I'm almost there. It went by really, really quick. Job is pointing some of that out. As a servant earnestly desireth the shadow, and as a hireling looketh for the reward of his work, so am I made to possess months of vanity, and wearisome nights are appointed unto me. Now, I want you to listen because this is building up to what I'm about to say when we close here in a moment. Notice that word vanity. That's the same word that Solomon is going to use in the book of Ecclesiastes later. That idea that life is meaningless, that there's no purpose, that there's nothing that satisfies. He said, when I lie down, now listen, I want you to hear the cry from this man's heart. When I lie down, I say, when shall I rise and the night be gone? And I am full of tossings to and fro until the dawning of the day. Now, you know what Job just said? I put it in a more modern sense. You know what he just said? I can't sleep. You know why? Can't turn my brain off. Can't stop thinking about all this. Can't stop thinking about my 10 children. Can't stop thinking about my wife. Can't stop thinking about why in the world is all of this happening to me. He said, I can't rest. I can't sleep. I can't do anything. All I do is toss to and fro until the dawning of the day. My flesh is clothed with worms and clods of dust. My skin is broken and become loathsome. He is literally describing what he looks like with all of these bleeding, oozing boils. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle and are spent. Notice this phrase. My days are spent without what? Hope. Hope. Folks, I want to tell you something. When you lose hope, you're in a world of hurt. You are in a world, when hope is completely gone, you're in a world of hurt. And that's where Job is. He says, my days are spent without hope. In other words, Job says, I'm not sitting here thinking next week it'll be better, next month it'll be better, next year it'll be better. He said, I have no hope. And very quickly, notice a couple more verses and we're going to wrap up. Oh, remember that my life is wind. Again, there's that idea of my life is going by so fast. Mine eyes shall no more see good. The eye of him that has seen me shall see me no more. Thine eyes are upon me and I am not. In other words, Job said, everything that I had is gone. It's never coming back. It's never going to be the way it was. As the cloud is consumed and vanishes away, so he that goeth down to the grave shall come up no more. He shall return no more to his house, neither shall his place know him any more. Therefore I will not refrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. In other words, Job said, because of what I've been through and because of where I am and because of the fact that I have no hope, I'm going to tell you guys what's really going on in my heart. He said, I'm just pouring out the truth. I'm telling you where I'm at. Am I a sea or a whale that thou saidest to watch over me? When I say my bed shall comfort me, my couch shall ease my complaint. Then, listen, he's looking right at Eliphaz when he says this. Then thou scaredest me with what? Dreams. He says, you're talking about some vision that you saw and God gave you some magical word to tell me and you're trying to scare me with that? That's not comforting me. That's not helping me. And you terrify me through visions so that my soul chooseth strangling and death rather than life. Job is saying, guys, you're not helping. I am in this pit. I'm hurting in ways that I can't even describe to you. And when I saw you three guys coming, I thought, okay, they're going to help me. They're going to encourage me. They're going to lift me up. He said, but so far, I'd rather die than keep talking to you guys. I am a man who spends his days without hope. Now listen. Hope is a really tenuous thing. I've said this before, but I'll throw it out there real quick. You know, sometimes people, they kind of know that when the doctor says, well, you know, it doesn't look good. This is not going well, but we're going to keep treating it, and we're going to keep trying this or trying that. Do you know a lot of times why doctors tell people when in the doctor's head, you know what the doctor knows? They're going to die. And there's nothing that can be done. But do you know why doctors oftentimes tell those little white lies and say, we're going to try this and we're going to try? Because you know what doctors understand? If I take away all They're just going to, that'll be it. It's a terrible thing to have no hope. I want to remind you very quickly of a story that you've heard me preach before here, but it's one of the great stories in the Bible. When Ezekiel the prophet was carried by God out into the wilderness, and God said, okay, Ezekiel, look around, and Ezekiel looks, and he's in the valley of the dry bones. And the fact that these bones are dry means they've been there a long, these are not like recently deceased bodies that are laying there, part flesh and part, no, these are dry bones. They've been out there forever, and they've been scattered. It's heads over here and legs over there and ribs over there. They're just scattered everywhere. And then God asked this question to Ezekiel. He says, Ezekiel, can these bones live? You know what God just asked? Is there any, what? Hope. You know what Ezekiel did? I love this because this is such a human thing. You know what we all want to think? We would say, oh God, anything's possible. That's not what Ezekiel said. Ezekiel looked out at all those bones laying there that had been there so long. And in Ezekiel's mind, he's thinking, there's no way. I mean, we're not talking about resurrecting somebody that's been dead a few hours or even a few days. These bones have been here for months, if not years. Everything in Ezekiel is saying, there's no hope. But when God is involved, you don't want to say that, right? So Ezekiel said, he was really, really smart. He didn't say yes or he didn't say no. He said, Lord, thou knowest. In other words, he said, it looks bad to me, but I love this. Here's kind of what he's saying. He's saying, God, if it was just me, I'd say there's no hope. But I know who you are. So I know that with you, there's always hope. You know what I've told people a lot of times? I've stood by a lot of people's bedside. A few of them, right after the doctor came in and said, you have terminal cancer. It's a matter of months. We're going to do some treatment. We're going to try and extend your life. But, the doctor walks out. And then I have to step up to the bedside. And that's one of the most horrible feelings you'll ever feel. But here's what I've always tried to tell people. I remember when I was with Miss Joyce Shockley, this several years ago, when that exact thing happened. I was in the room with her and Angie. The doctor came in, dropped that bomb. After he left, I walked up to Joyce, as I have a lot of people down through the years, and I said, now listen, Joyce, I know what the doctor said. But there's a higher authority over him. There is a God in heaven who holds our life in his hands. And with God, there is always hope. Do you remember that prayer David prayed for his little baby boy that was so sick? As long as he was alive, I prayed. Because who knows what God might do? Hope. And I don't know what you may be going through tonight. I don't know what your situation may be, but I just want to tell you, whatever it is, as long as there's a God in heaven, there is hope. Let's pray. Father, thank you. Thank you for this great story. Father, thank you for this man named Job. Such a remarkable person. Father, none of us are going through what he went through. But a lot of people are going through their own struggles and battles and valleys. And Father, if we don't remember anything as we walk out of here in a few moments, help us just to remember this. No matter what the situation, when God is involved, there is always hope. Father, there may be